Are you tired of spending a small fortune on home decor? Well, you don't have to. In today's video, I'll be sharing 10 DIY decor projects using items that you already have around your house and your yard, from repurposing old cans and jars to creating unique wall art using natural materials. I hope you'll be inspired to see the potential in simple and discarded items. So, if you like free, let's get started.
For this first project, I'll be combining a plastic jug and sticks from my yard. I used a utility knife to cut the bottom third off an empty juice jug, and then evened out the cut edges with scissors. I wanted to attach sticks to the sides of the jug, and I felt the sticks would adhere to fabric better than plastic, so I first hot glued a strip of burlap around the jug. Once it was firmly adhered, I began hot gluing sticks to the burlap. I had previously cut up several sticks to the same length. I tried to use the straightest sticks I could find. Finding straight sticks was probably the most challenging part of this project. I was planning to attach the jug to an old cutting board or piece of wood, so I didn't cover the back side. Once the front and sides were covered, I used my miter shears to even up the sticks along the top and bottom edges. To make sure the sticks would stay put, I wrapped 2 strips of florist wire around the jug near the top and bottom edges and twisted them tightly along the back side. Then, to hide the wire, I hot glued some Dollar Tree burlap ribbon over both strips of wire. At this point, I realized I should have covered the bottom of the jug. So I traced around another jug and cut out a piece of burlap to fit and hot glued it in place. I decided to attach the jug to this old cutting board, but first I needed to sand out all the cuts and scratches with my orbital sander. Next, I stained the wood with some watered-down antiquing wax. To give the board a grayer, aged wood color, I went over it a second time, this time using white wax. To attach the jug to the board, I marked where I wanted to drill and then drilled 2 holes through the board. I ran screws through the back of the board and into the plastic jug. I added an additional screw on the front side, going through the top center of the jug and into the board. For a more finished look, I hot glued some additional burlap trim along the inside back edge of the jug. For this next project, I had planned on using full-sized clothespins, but since I had a ton of the tiny ones, I decided to use them instead. First, I removed the metal springs from about 25 clothespins. Next, I pulled up some pictures of butterflies on my iPad. While looking at the pictures, I began arranging the clothespins and gluing them together with wood glue. I quickly realized that I would need to switch to super glue, which would dry immediately when sprayed with an accelerator. I rarely use super glue without using an accelerator. You really need to have a can in your stash. So if you don't, I have some linked in my Amazon store. Once I had a section of the butterfly arranged how I liked, I applied super glue over all of the joints and then sprayed it with accelerator. Next, I painted the body section of the butterfly with black acrylic paint, and I painted the wings with watered down blue acrylic paint. When the paint was dry, I added some additional color to the wings, again referencing a butterfly picture to guide my painting choices. I wanted a more rustic effect, so to tone down the colors, I sanded over the paint once it was dry. To create a base for the butterfly, I found an odd piece of wood that was actually shaped like a rock. I drilled a small hole all the way through the butterfly's body and into the piece of wood. Then I ran a piece of black florist wire through the hole in the butterfly. Before attaching it to the wood, I bent another small piece of wire into the shape of antenna and hot glued it to the back of the butterfly's head. I applied some Gorilla Glue to the end of the large piece of wire before inserting it into the hole I had drilled in the wood. To add color and interest, I hot glued some moss to the wood and drilled a second hole to insert some dried flowers. If you want to duplicate this exact butterfly, I linked a close-up picture in the description box so you can see how I arranged the clothespins. If you want cheap crafting supplies, you can't get much cheaper than sticks and stones. I dug around in one of my flower beds to find some rocks that I could use to make a bird. I started with a medium-sized stone for the body. Then I used Gorilla Super Glue to attach smaller rocks that I thought resembled the shape of a bird's beak and wing. Next, I took a strand of dead ivy vine from my yard and twisted it into the shape of a bird's nest, securing it with a piece of florist wire. Then I hot glued some dead pine needles into the center of the nest and added a small rock for an egg. To turn this into wall art, you'll need an old picture frame, tray, or piece of wood. Cut a branch to fit your frame. To attach it, I drilled a tiny hole and then carefully hammered a small nail through the hole. I also applied a bit of wood glue in a couple different spots. I used hot glue to attach the bird nest to the tray and Gorilla Glue to attach the bird. I felt like it really needed a pop of color, so I pulled some small leaves off of a faux stem and hot glued them in various spots on the branches. I also decided to add a Dollar Tree rub-on word transfer across the bottom of the tray. I still needed to remove the tray's small feet and add a sawtooth hanger to the back of the tray so that it could be hung from a wall. I should have done this at the very beginning. Now, let's skip the rocks and use sticks and paper. Start by printing out some images that you like on cardstock in your desired sizes. Then cut out some pieces of chipboard in the same sizes. Chipboard is the thin cardboard that cereal boxes are made from. Attach a piece of chipboard to a scrap piece of wood. I used staples because most glues don't adhere well to old wood like I was using. Next, use glue stick to adhere your image to the chipboard. Now, to create a frame, cut and hot glue small sticks around the four edges of your picture. Use miter shears to adjust the length of your sticks as needed. I overlap the sticks for a more rustic appearance. For an extra touch, I drilled a hole in the top of the wood and screwed in a decorative plaque ring that I had removed from something else. As an alternate project, Use glue stick to adhere an image to a piece of chipboard, and then hot glue the sticks directly to the four sides of the picture. This time I cut the sticks to meet in the corners. To cover the print on the chipboard and make it more durable, I glued a second piece of chipboard to the back side. Then, to create an easel, I hot glued one end of a stick to the back side, holding the stick outward while the glue dried. I took a small strip of burlap and hot glued that over the end of the stick, and then I added a small piece of a different stick between the larger stick and the chipboard. Once the hot glue dried, it was actually quite sturdy. Now, let's use a piece of wood cut from a big branch and some florist wire. I used my orbital sander to remove some of the bark from my branch for a cleaner look. To create a flower for the branch, I cut several strands of wire into about 12-inch lengths. Then I wrapped about half of the length of each wire around a small paintbrush 12 to 15 times and pushed it off so that the end of the wire would stay tightly coiled. I repeated this process about 20 times. Then I began wrapping the opposite end of the wire strands around a small, sturdy stick. Once all the wires were wrapped around the stick, I wrapped a small piece of brown florist tape around the bottom few strands of wire to keep them from sliding down the stick. To attach the wire flower to the branch, I drilled a small hole in the center of the branch, added some Gorilla Glue, and then inserted the stick. To dress up the branch, I printed out two small, identical butterfly images and glued them back to make it two-sided. Then I hot glued it to the branch. If the edges of the butterfly are white from the paper, you can touch them up with a coordinating marker or paint pen. I made some antennae from a small piece of florist wire and hot glued them to the butterfly. I also added some moss to fill in a crack created when I cut the branch. If you're a regular crafter or have small children, then you probably have popsicle sticks on hand. I love to cut both ends off the sticks and use the small pieces to create scalloped details. They're easy to cut with a good pair of scissors or miter shears. I'm embellishing the lid that I removed from a photo storage box that I used last week when making a rabbit totem. First, I figured out the spacing and arrangement of the scallops. Then I used wood glue to secure them in place. I sanded the frame first so that the glue would be able to grip it better. Once the wood glue was dry, I painted the frame with an ivory chalk paint and salt wash mixture to give it some texture. It needed 2 coats of paint, and when the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the frame with 220 grit sandpaper. And then I went over the frame with some antiquing wax, wiping away most of it. For art to put in the frame, I picked a couple flowers from my yard and pressed them using my iron and paper towels. I set the heat to medium-high, turned off the steam, and then pressed for 20 seconds on and 20 seconds off. I just continued this process until the flowers were completely dry. I replaced the paper towels several times during the process. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes depending on the thickness of your flowers. To add my dried flowers to the frame, I glued a piece of cardstock to the back of the frame using spray adhesive. Then I sprayed the adhesive on the back side of the flower and pressed it onto the cardstock. I also printed out and glued a label to the cardstock to give it that vintage botanical vibe. Because this was originally a lid for a box and not a traditional frame, I cleaned up the back side by adhering a piece of brown craft paper and attaching a sawtooth hanger. For this next project, I used shells, but if you don't have shells, you could use rocks or other decorative objects. Working on one shell at a time, I applied a light even coat of Mod Podge to the inside of my shells. Then I cut small pieces of decorative tissue paper just large enough to cover the inside of my shells. If you don't have tissue paper, the top patterned ply of napkins would also work. As I pressed the tissue paper into the shell, I cut a few slits in places where the paper needed to mold to the curves of the shell. I also used a Ziploc bag to help me mold the tissue paper to the shell without tearing it. Then I applied a top coat of Mod Podge and let it dry. When it was dry, I came back with sandpaper and sanded off the extra tissue paper around the edges of the shell. Then, using a small flat brush, I went around the outer edge of the tissue paper and applied just a bit of gold metallic paint that I had on hand, creating a gold rim around the shell. Last week, I asked viewers what item they would most like to see me use in today's video, and the majority of you voted for tin cans. So here is one of my favorite ways to repurpose tin cans. First, when cutting open the can, sometimes I like to leave the lid attached a bit. Then I paint the can and the lid with some textured paint. That's paint mixed with salt wash, baking soda, or plaster of Paris. After the paint's dry, I distress the can with sandpaper. For this project, I also painted and distressed a tart pan to create a small pedestal for my tin can. I found and printed out a vintage floral label to coordinate with the faux daylilies that I was planning to put in the can. I decoupaged the label to the can using Mod Podge. Then I added styrofoam to the can, stuck in my faux flowers, and covered the styrofoam with some moss. I applied a coat of Mod Podge over the top of the label to make it more durable so it wouldn't easily tear or stain. This time, instead of making a butterfly from paper, I just used the top transparent portion of a Dollar Tree butterfly sticker and hot glued it to the can's lid. I used Gorilla Super Glue to attach the tart tin to the bottom of the tin can. And finally, to complement the wavy tart tin, I hot glued some pink rickrack around the tart tin, around the can, and around the lid. For this next project, you can use a cardboard or foam egg carton, whatever you have on hand. Cut out the individual cups to create mushroom caps. If you're using foam like me, massage the cup to soften it up and then turn it inside out. This creates a more realistic mushroom shape. Paint your cups with regular chalk paint or textured paint. You can use a variety of items to create stems for your caps. Sticks are a good option. However, for something different, I'm using some empty glitter jars and a tiny Dollar Tree jar. I hot glued the jar lids inside the foam caps, cutting a slit for the tabs on the glitter jar lids to fit through. I screwed the lids back on the jars and then painted the caps in fun colors. You can fill the jars with whatever you like. I used moss, feathers, and faux flowers. I also hot glued some decorative trim around the bottom of each jar. Once the paint on the egg carton caps was completely dry, I used the small end of a paintbrush handle to dab on some polka dots to the mushroom caps. You'll need to find another rock for this next project, preferably a round or oval flat rock. Next, print out an image of an agate or geode slice on copy paper in a size to cover the surface of your rock. Apply a thin, even coat of Mod Podge to the smoothest side of your rock and to the back of your image. Adhere the image to the rock. Use a Ziploc bag to help you carefully smooth out the edges and any wrinkles in the paper. Find a frame with a sturdy back for your rock. Honestly, I don't even remember what my frame was from. I covered the back piece with a piece of thin cotton fabric pulled taut. Then I covered the entire back side of my frame with brown paper packing tape. I used a combination of Gorilla Glue and hot glue to adhere the rock to the front of the fabric. Once the Gorilla Glue was dry, the rock really was securely attached. The next day, I decided to paint the edges of the rock with some beige paint to help it blend in better with the image. Thank you so much for watching today, and thank you to Corinne, my sweet viewer who sent me this amazing Lincoln bust. If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more ideas using free items, here's another video I think you'll like.